Cheating doesn't usually reveal itself through obvious evidence. It reveals itself through misalignment. Small shifts between what someone says, how they act, and how they feel when they're around you. And the reason most people miss it isn't because the signs aren't there. It's because the signs don't look the way they expect. People are trained to look for extremes, secret messages, clear lies, sudden disappearances. But real infidelity often hides inside behaviors that are easy to explain individually, yet difficult to ignore when they repeat. And this is where psychology becomes important. Because when someone is living two emotional realities at once, their behavior starts to split. Not dramatically, but subtly. Their attention divides. Their emotional responses shift. Their consistency changes in ways that feel small in isolation, but significant in pattern. And your mind notices that before you can logically explain it. That feeling that something is off isn't random. It's your brain detecting inconsistencies faster than your conscious mind can label them. The problem is, most people don't trust that signal. They look for proof instead of patterns. And by the time proof appears, the pattern has already been there for a long time. Sign number 1, their curiosity about you decreases, but their awareness of you increases. This is one of the least obvious but most telling psychological shifts. At the beginning of a relationship, curiosity flows naturally. They ask questions. They engage. They want to understand your thoughts, your experiences, your perspective. That curiosity is a form of emotional investment. But when that investment starts redirecting elsewhere, something changes. They stop asking as much, but they start observing more. They notice your reactions, your tone, your timing, not out of deeper connection, but out of awareness of how their behavior might be perceived. This creates a subtle imbalance. You feel less explored, less understood, but more monitored. Conversations become less about connection and more about maintaining stability. And this happens because their focus is divided. Their emotional curiosity is being invested somewhere else, while their attention toward you becomes more strategic. Experts in behavioral psychology often point out that when someone is hiding something, they don't disengage completely. They adjust their engagement. And that adjustment can feel like distance, but with an undercurrent of control. You're less known, but more watched. And that shift is rarely random. Sign number 2, their stories stay consistent, but feel overstructured. When people lie, they don't always contradict themselves. In fact, many become more consistent, but in a controlled way. Their stories are clear, logical, structured, almost too smooth. And that's because they're not recalling naturally, they're maintaining a version of events. This creates a subtle difference in how information is delivered. Real experiences tend to have variation, small inconsistencies, natural pauses, adjustments in detail as memory unfolds. But constructed narratives often feel rehearsed, stable, unchanging across retellings. And while that might seem like honesty, it can actually signal the opposite. Because maintaining consistency requires effort, cognitive effort, and that effort changes how communication feels. You might notice that their explanations answer your questions, but don't invite further ones. They close loops instead of opening them. And if you revisit the same topic later, the answer comes back almost identical. Not because it's true, but because it's memorized. This doesn't prove deception on its own. But psychologically, when someone is managing information instead of expressing it, their communication becomes more about control than connection. And over time, that controlled consistency starts to feel different from natural transparency. Sign number 3. Their emotional reactions become slightly out of sync with the situation. Emotions usually match context. When something is light, the response feels light. When something is serious, the tone adjusts naturally. But when someone is managing a hidden reality, that alignment can start to slip. Not in obvious ways, but in small mismatches. They might react too quickly or too slowly, laugh at the wrong moment, seem distracted during something meaningful, then unexpectedly engage during something minor. And these shifts are easy to overlook because each one, on its own, can be explained. Fatigue, stress, distraction. But over time, a pattern forms where their emotional responses don't fully match the moment they're in. This happens because their attention isn't fully anchored in the present interaction. Part of their cognitive and emotional energy is elsewhere, managing thoughts, maintaining consistency, or anticipating what might be questioned next. And that divided focus creates slight delays or misalignments in emotional expression. You might not consciously register each instance, but you feel the difference. The interaction feels less synchronized, less natural. And that lack of synchronization is subtle, but important. Because emotional alignment is one of the core signals of genuine presence. When it starts to drift, even slightly, it suggests that presence is no longer fully where it appears to be. Sign number 4. They become more organized in some areas and less predictable in others. One of the lesser-known psychological effects of deception is compensation. When someone is managing something hidden, they often become more controlled in certain areas of their life. Schedules, routines, communication patterns. They create structure to maintain consistency. But at the same time, other areas become less predictable. Timing shifts, availability changes, plans feel less stable. And this contrast creates confusion. Because on one hand, they seem more put together, more intentional. On the other, less reliable, less aligned with previous patterns. This happens because cognitive resources are being redistributed. Managing a hidden layer requires attention, and that attention has to come from somewhere. So while they increase control where they can, unpredictability leaks into other areas. You might notice that some things feel more precise than before, while others feel more uncertain. And that inconsistency isn't random. It reflects an internal imbalance between control and capacity, because maintaining one reality while hiding another requires effort. And that effort always shows up somewhere in behavior, not necessarily as a clear sign, but as a shift in how stable or predictable someone feels over time. Sign number 5. You start feeling like you need to check, instead of naturally trust. When it's intact, feels effortless. You don't need to verify. You don't need to monitor. You don't feel the urge to double-check details or look for confirmation. But when something shifts, that changes. You begin noticing a subtle impulse to check, to confirm timelines, to pay closer attention to small details. Not because you want to invade privacy, but because something feels unresolved. And this is where many people misinterpret their own behavior. They label it as insecurity, as overthinking. But psychologically, this shift often reflects a response to inconsistency. Your mind is trying to reconcile patterns that don't fully align. And instead of finding clarity through direct information, it starts seeking it through observation. This doesn't mean the conclusion you fear is automatically true, but it does mean that your sense of certainty has been disrupted. And certainty doesn't disappear without a reason. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. The more you feel the need to check, the less natural trust feels. And the less natural trust feels, the more you question yourself. But that initial shift, from effortless trust to active verification, is rarely random. It's usually a response to something in the dynamic that no longer feels fully transparent. When you look at these signs together, a different picture starts to form. Not one based on obvious evidence, but on psychological misalignment. Curiosity shifting into observation, communication becoming structured instead of natural, emotional responses losing synchronization, behavior becoming both more controlled and more unpredictable, trust shifting into verification. None of these on their own confirm infidelity, but together they point to a deeper change in how someone is showing up, and that change matters. Because relationships rely on coherence, a sense that behavior, emotion, and communication all align. When that coherence breaks, even subtly, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty, when it persists, becomes the dominant experience. You're no longer fully relaxed in the connection. You're aware, observing, interpreting. And that shift alone signals that something is no longer functioning the same way it once did. The challenge is not just recognizing these patterns, It's deciding what to do with them. Because most people don't act immediately. They wait. They observe longer. They look for something more concrete. And while that instinct makes sense, it can also prolong confusion, because patterns don't clarify themselves without attention. They repeat. They deepen. They become more defined over time. And the longer they go unaddressed, the more they shape how you experience the relationship. So the goal isn't to jump to conclusions. It's to shift from passive observation to active awareness, to acknowledge that something has changed, even if you don't fully understand why yet. Because that acknowledgement is what moves you out of uncertainty and into evaluation. And evaluation is where clarity begins. At the center of this is a simple but difficult question. Does the relationship still feel aligned? Not based on history, not based on intention, but based on current experience. Alignment isn't about perfection. It's about consistency between what is said, what is done, and how it feels. And when those elements stop matching, the relationship requires attention, not because something is definitively wrong, but because something is no longer clear. And clarity is what allows trust to exist. Without it, everything becomes interpretative. You start filling gaps instead of understanding them. And over time, that creates distance. Not always visible, but felt. Because relationships don't break only through actions. They shift through perception. And once perception changes, the entire dynamic changes with it. Here's the final piece. Clarity is built, not found. It doesn't appear on its own. It comes from observation, communication, and a willingness to face what's actually happening instead of what you hope is happening. Whether these patterns lead to a difficult conversation, a deeper understanding, or a decision about the future, they all point to the same thing, the need for awareness. Because staying in uncertainty doesn't protect the relationship. It delays resolution. And resolution, even when uncomfortable, creates direction. You may not control what the other person is doing, but you control whether you ignore patterns or respond to them. And that choice determines whether you stay in confusion or move toward clarity. If any of these signs felt familiar, don't ignore that awareness. Comment below which one stood out to you the most. And if you want more breakdowns like this, real patterns, real psychology, no filters, make sure to subscribe. Because the next thing we're going to explore might completely change how you read behavior.